In the late 1800s, if you walked into a pharmacy with a headache, fatigue, a chest cold, or perhaps just a vague sense of Victorian melancholy, the pharmacist might not lean in with a sympathetic frown and offer you aspirin. No. He might adjust his monocle, stroke his moustache contemplatively, even if he didn't have one, and serve you a fizzy glass of what was, quite frankly, a medical marvel of the age. Coca-Cola. Yes, that Coca-Cola. But perhaps we should float back a little further, gently, like a goose feather drifting down onto an apothecary counter in a Georgia summer breeze. The year is 1886. The place? Atlanta. The air smells faintly of cigar smoke, horse sweat, and optimism. And a man named John Stith Pemberton, a former Confederate colonel turned pharmacist, is tinkering with a tonic in his backyard lab. Pemberton was the sort of Southern gentleman whose idea of a relaxing afternoon included a little light chemistry, and possibly some light morphine. He'd been badly wounded in the Civil War, a saber slash across the chest from a time when health insurance was mostly drink this and hope. To cope with the pain, he fell back on the healing comforts of laudanum, one of history's more exciting opiates. But with time and sarsaparilla dreams, he began seeking a less destructive alternative. You know, something the church ladies might sip while talking about embroidery or the mysterious disappearance of the neighbor's cat. And so into his mixing vat went sugar syrup, cola nut extract for caffeine, and a suspiciously generous amount of coca leaf, the same plant that also gives us cocaine. Yes, real deal cocaine. Coca-Cola's early recipe contained about 9 milligrams per glass, which today would warrant an FBI visit and possibly a starring role in someone's docuseries. Pemberton also tossed in damiana, a Mexican herb sometimes promoted as an aphrodisiac. Because why stop at perking you up when you can also make the heart flutter with post-Victorian flirtation? He dubbed the concoction Pemberton's French wine coca, which sounds both prestigious and absolutely like something you'd order by accident on a date, only to find yourself proposing marriage to a waiter named Herbert. Unfortunately for our pharmaceutical Romeo, Atlanta soon voted itself dry. Not in weather, in law. Georgia had caught a case of prohibition years before it was fashionable nationwide. No more wine tonics for the good people of the city. Panic, one assumes, ensued. But Pemberton, ever the innovator and never one to waste a good caffeinated alkaloid, simply removed the wine, added more fizz, and wrapped it all up in the comforting quilt of Victorian health claims. Thus was born Coca-Cola. And it wasn't sold as a soft drink. Oh no, it was a medicine, a miracle tonic, advertised to treat headaches, fatigue, digestive troubles, hysteria, neuralgia, and probably things like having feelings or reading novels after dark. You could walk right into your local pharmacy and order a refreshing glass of Coca-Cola at the soda fountain while the pharmacist beside you measured out arsenic with a look of deep concentration. It was a golden age of questionable prescriptions and even more questionable mustache oils. Now, one might wonder, how did this elixir of wellness gain traction? For starters, it tasted pretty decent, especially compared to some of its competition. Many tonics of the day tasted like regret and varnish, followed by a fleeting sense of euphoria. Coca-Cola, however, was sweet, bubbly, and gave people a small chemical pick-me-up courtesy of its botanical components. Pharmacists handed it out with an air of professional authority, the same way a modern doctor might hand over a prescription for mild antibiotics, but with the added charm of carbonation and the faint possibility of a Coke-fueled waltz. Coca-Cola advertisements began to appear in cautiously embroidered fonts, boasting it as a delightful brain tonic and an invigorator of the nerves. You can almost hear the gentle rustle of parasols and the soft fizz of soda behind lace curtains, as the ladies of the town shared stories of how a teaspoon of the stuff made their husbands seem briefly tolerable. Ironically, Pemberton himself never profited much from his invention. Plagued by failing health and a growing reliance on his own product, A truly poetic twist, he began selling off shares of the formula. By the time of his death in 1888, most of the rights belonged to Asa Candler, a man with the vision, marketing genius, and possibly fewer moral hesitations needed to make Coca-Cola a household name, and in due time, the single most popular fizzy, non-health drink on the planet. Still, in those early days, before neon signs, polar bears in scarves, and $12 collectibles, Coca-Cola was a kind of syrupy alchemy. Sitting in a glass at a pharmacy counter, promising to cure all ills and perhaps make your day 17% more buoyant. And with that lovingly carbonated thought, let your eyes grow heavier, your breath slower, as we gently drift onward into the velvet folds of history's more unusual remedies. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Let's take a deep breath together now. In through the nose, out through the mouth, and drift gently back into the twilight haze of the 19th century. A time when the streets smelled like horse, tobacco, and overly ambitious optimism. And in the gentle lull of 1880s America, somewhere between the clang of new industry and the coughing fits caused by untreated consumption, a curious little trend was quietly bubbling to the surface, in more ways than one. Enter the apothecary. The original health food store, except instead of vegan cheese and coconut flax elixirs, it offered mercury rubs, arsenic wafers, and spirits so strong they could knock you directly into the next spiritual realm. These were not your average corner shops. Oh no, they smelled like menthol, oak barrels, mysterious root extractions, and possibly mild regret. In short, paradise for your neighborhood hypochondriac with $1 and a dream. It was in one of these wood-paneled, phonograph-playing sanctuaries that a certain war-weary man named John Pemberton began experimenting with what doctors of the time might generously call medicine, and what modern pharmacists might call an absolute violation of every known regulation. Pemberton was a Confederate colonel turned pharmacist, a man whose resume read like the plot of a Southern Gothic novella. After taking a saber wound in the American Civil War and becoming, frankly, way too acquainted with morphine, Pemberton sought a cure for his own addiction. Naturally, he turned to science and flavor. Now, to be fair, the late 1800s were practically bubbling over with miracle tonics. Every household had at least one amber bottle that promised to cure everything from neuralgia to melancholia to what we now know was probably just seasonal allergies. Women applied cocaine drops for toothaches. Gentlemen sipped opium tinctures before writing sentimental letters about clouds. Symptoms, feelings, existential dread. There was a syrup for that. John Pemberton's own creation began its life not as a soft drink, but as a medicinal marvel. He lovingly pitched as French wine coca. And yes, it was exactly as glamorous and concerning as the name implies. A blend of Bordeaux wine and coca leaves that was supposed to invigorate both the nerves and the morality of the upper middle class. A glass of energizing buzz for the lady of the parlor. It didn't take long before French wine coca was lining the shelves of southern apothecaries, sold not only as a hangover remedy, but also as a treatment for depression, indigestion, impotence, and, of course, your classic 19th century nervous exhaustion, which was basically being alive on a weekday. But as fate and politics would have it, the 1880s brought a swell of temperance movements to Georgia. Alcohol, it seemed, would soon be falling out of official favor. Wine tonics were in trouble, and that meant John Pemberton's fizzy solution had to sober up fast. So, with the kind of reckless innovation only a morphine-addled genius could muster, Pemberton began reworking his formula. He took out the wine, left in the coca leaf, and added a touch of cola nut extract, an ingredient known for its caffeine and a name with an oddly catchy rhythm. Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola. You might assume that, at this point, he had a breakthrough moment, a eureka cry echoed from the back room of his small Atlanta lab. But no. Instead, what happened was slightly more charming. He left his apprentice to mix up the syrup with carbonated water by accident. A humble fizz, a surprising taste, and the world's most medicinal soft drink was born in a teacup-sized oops. Almost immediately, the new blend found its way behind soda fountains, those marble-topped shrines to elixirs and sarsaparillas. There, mustachioed soda jerks, called jerks, not out of insult, but because they had to jerk the soda handle, served Coca-Cola by the ounce, as a health tonic, mind you. You didn't go down for a Coke because you were thirsty. You went because your spleen hurt, or your thoughts felt sluggish, or you had an appointment to see Miss Eliza and didn't want to faint from sheer giddiness. This was how the fizzy future arrived, with medicinal marketing, a dash of caffeine, and just enough coca extract to put a bounce in your Victorian bustle. No one knew quite what they were drinking, but it made them feel oddly cheerful. And for that, Coca-Cola was declared quite simply, just what the doctor ordered. As we gently tilt our rocking chair back and forth on this porch of curious history, we begin to hear a new sound faintly building down the cobbled street, the clink of glass bottles and the sharp hiss of carbonated excitement. It's time we take a quiet stroll to the soda fountain, where a few clever business minds are preparing to turn this bubbly little medicine into an empire. One 20-cent dose at a time. Let us drift now to a place that smelled faintly of ink, desperation, and something herbal that may or may not have been opium. It is 1886 in Atlanta, Georgia, a time when people wore corsets tight enough to crack ribs, and then wondered why they had headaches. It's also where we find a former Confederate lieutenant colonel named John Stith Pemberton, rifling through glass bottles and powders like a Victorian-era wizard, preparing for a modestly disastrous spell. John Pemberton was not just a military man, which frankly was sort of a requirement back then. No, he was also a pharmacist, a compounder of elixirs, a mixer of potions, and a man who believed that just about anything could be cured with the right combination of secret recipes, mild stimulants, and a keen eye for branding. Wounded during the Civil War, Pemberton had developed a rather unfortunate reliance on morphine, a fairly common side effect of getting your torso pierced by swords and filled with 19th century medicine. Like many veterans of his time, he was looking for a way out. Not emotionally, he just really wanted to stop using morphine, preferably by switching to something he invented himself. Which brings us neatly to what he called his French wine coca. A name like that suggests something lavish, perhaps a sparkling beverage sipped under golden chandeliers in Paris, accompanied by melancholy violin music and a gentle breeze of absinthe. But this concoction was less Eiffel Tower, more wild experiment held together with ambition and whatever was lying around. To be clear, French wine coca was not entirely unique. There was already a fashionable beverage in Europe known as vin mariani, an alcoholic tonic made with coca leaves, which, yes, are the very same leaves later processed into cocaine. Vin mariani was the toast of literary salons and popes alike. It made you feel very awake, very important, and probably very ready to write 18 unsolicited poems. Pemberton, being the enterprising sort of man who wouldn't let a little thing like chemical dependency slow him down, decided to make his own American spin on it. His wine-based version combined high-quality alcohol with coca leaf extract and cola nut, a stimulant-rich seed known to deliver a pleasing jitter. Add a dash of Damiana, an herb marketed with a straight face as an aphrodisiac and mood enhancer, and you had what could only be described as liquid confidence, served lukewarm. He labeled it a nerve tonic, perfect for curing headaches, fatigue, indigestion, depression, listlessness, and presumably any other human emotion that dared flutter through your ribcage. It was marketed as medicine you didn't have to suffer to swallow. Medicine with personality, flavor, and the tantalizing possibility that it might make you incredibly popular at dinner parties. Pemberton was fond of telling people his creation would tone the system, a phrase that was famously flexible at the time. Toning might mean stimulating, or calming, or both at once, which feels physiologically confusing. But in the 1880s, scientific rigor often took a backseat to creative labeling and an elegant mustache. Tucked into his Atlanta drugstore, Pemberton began selling French wine Coca by the glass, promoting it with testimonials, newspaper ads, and probably a great deal of theatrical gesturing. It wasn't long before local physicians began prescribing it to patients with, well, anything. Nervous exhaustion, wine Coca. Neuralgia, wine Coca. Can't get through another tedious sewing circle without weeping into your upholstery? You know the answer. Enter, of course, the prohibition forces. By 1886, Atlanta passed a temperance law banning the sale of alcohol. This was a bit of a bother, as the word wine was doing a lot of the heavy lifting in French wine Coca. But Pemberton was not a man easily daunted by civic morality or public health. He simply decided to remove the wine and not remove anything else that might be considered mildly concerning. The new non-alcoholic version kept the Coca and the cola, creating a syrupy, stimulating mixture that still felt like a performance-enhancing potion straight out of a time-traveling apothecary kit. In its updated form, it now bore a new name, one simple, strong, and suspiciously invigorating. But we'll sip that next chapter slowly, as the light leaves the windows of the past and the hush of invention slips gently into dream, as the moon cast its pale spotlight across the rooftops of 1880s Atlanta. A peculiar little figure shuffled through the gaslit streets with a pocket full of herbs and a head full of ideas. That figure was John Stith Pemberton, pharmacist, chemist, Confederate veteran, and, depending on whom you asked, either a tortured genius or a man determined to bottle lightning and sell it by the ounce. Now, you must understand, dear listener, that the late 19th century had a rather optimistic idea of what counted as medicine. If it came from a plant, sparkled suspiciously, or made your neighbors hallucinate that their furniture was speaking fluent French, it was probably good for circulation, or maybe digestion, or your sinuses. Nobody was entirely sure. Pemberton had already been dabbling in such alchemy for some time. He wasn't new to the business of pharmacological artistry. He had invented Dr. Tuggle's compound syrup of globe flower, a name which sounds like it might cure something, though possibly also summon an ancient forest spirit if taken after sunset. But Pemberton's true opus, his magnum elixir, if you will, began as something altogether more continental. French wine Coca. Yes, French wine Coca. It was modeled after a popular European tonic called Vin Mariani, which offered a heady mix of Bordeaux wine and coca leaves, the latter being the raw botanical behind, well, cocaine. The drink was all the rage in Parisian apothecaries and cabarets alike, admired equally by sheriffs and poets, which frankly tells you all you need to know. John S. Pemberton, never one to let the French have all the chemically enhanced fun, concocted his own American version, which blended the stimulating spark of coca leaves with the mellowing bouquet of wine. It was described glowingly as a nerve tonic, a digestive aid, and a helpful treatment for morphine addiction. Because of course, while morphine was seen as an entirely reasonable post-war prescription, it was also known to occasionally, "You're going to turn your body to wax and your morals to jelly." Pemberton, it's worth noting, had become addicted to morphine himself after sustaining injuries during the Civil War. So his medicinal pursuits had a deeply personal flavor, equal parts empathy, and desperate self-experimentation. For a time, French wine Coca won decent popularity locally. Advertisements in the Atlanta newspapers sang its praises, heralding it as a remedy for melancholy, neuralgia, and afflictions peculiar to females, which sounds both concerning and incredibly vague. Accounts say Pemberton even doled out free samples to his fellow citizens, which may explain why nearby squirrels began writing sonnets. But then came a small, inconvenient development: prohibition. It loomed like an ominous cloud over Atlanta, with city leaders inching toward bans on alcohol that would not only make parties awkward, but also, more problematically, for Dr. Pemberton, render his wine-based tonic illegal. And this posed a serious challenge. After all, It's rather difficult to sell your invention as a family-friendly nerve tonic when it smells like a vineyard exploded in your kitchen. So, with the city tightening its corset and threatening to outlaw anything funnier than lukewarm tea, John S. Pemberton went back to his lab, his pharmacist's shanty really, and began tinkering. He removed the Bordeaux wine and replaced it with a syrup sweet enough to give a hummingbird the jitters. He kept the coca extract, of course, why rob the drink of its personality, and added cola nut extract for flavor and caffeine. He called it Coca-Cola, which, to be fair, was slightly less French, but no less charming. Interestingly, alcohol was out, but cocaine was still very much in. Early advertising for Coca-Cola hailed it as the ideal temperance drink, and in a way it was. You could now get your buzz without the ugly side effect of fisticuffs at the saloon. So late into many an Atlanta evening, as gaslights flickered in pharmacies and barbershops, and overly enthusiastic mustaches glowed with grooming oil, a few lucky souls sipped a strange new syrup that boasted taste, sparkle, and a touch of mysterious vigor. It didn't get you tipsy, but it made you talk faster, blink louder, and suddenly reorganize your entire pantry alphabetically. The curious potion was catching on. Soon, Coca-Cola would find its way into soda fountains and general stores, sold by the glass for 5 cents. Hardly a scandalous price for a product once brewed like a gothic novel in a wine vat. But what made Coca-Cola so enduring? Why did this particular tonic survive when hundreds of others, snake oil wonder elixir, Professor Mirth's soothing tar, you get the idea, vanished like mint vapor? Ah, my dreamy historian. That has something to do with fizz, storytelling, and the shrewdest partner Pemberton never saw coming. But we'll ease into that with quiet steps. Atlanta in the 1880s, a city gently shrugging off the ashes of Civil War reconstruction, trading burnt timbers for trimmed mustaches, and horse-drawn wagons for more horse-drawn wagons. But in one quiet pharmacy, a peculiar sort of magic was bubbling to life. Fizzy, faintly brown, and suspiciously medicinal. Enter John Stith Pemberton, former Confederate colonel, practicing pharmacist, self-proclaimed pain relief enthusiast, and full-time wearer of impressive facial hair. Pemberton had a vision, and less romantically, a morphine addiction. You see, after an injury sustained during the war, he'd been prescribed morphine, as many veterans were. Unfortunately, the 19th century solution to pain was often to just invent a new form of it, wrapped in a slightly different tincture. Seeking to free himself from the charming yet problematic embrace of morphine, Pemberton turned to his true love, chemistry. Not the modern kind with protective goggles and fume hoods, but the old-school version with glass beakers, open flames, and the occasional mysterious explosion that no one wanted to talk about again. And so, through his own personal cocktail of trial, error, and hopeful gulping, Dr. Pemberton whipped up a tonic made from coca leaves, which, yes, contained actual cocaine, and cola nuts, famously caffeinated and intriguingly bitter. Fancying himself both a healer and an entrepreneur, he called it Pemberton's French Wine Coca, très chic. Now, before you imagine genteel Parisians sipping it in cafes, no. It was more likely being served in smoky southern apothecaries to customers prone to phrases like aches of the spleen and nervous afflictions of the feminine variety. Pemberton wasn't selling mere refreshment. He was peddling improvement in a bottle. His tonic promised to cure everything from digestive troubles to melancholy to, quite optimistically, incurable headaches. A real miracle, assuming you took another dose every few hours, promptly, with a splash of hope and a sprinkle of denial. But just as the concoction began catching local lips and imaginations, disaster struck. Atlanta, in its infinite wisdom, banned the sale of alcohol. No more French. No more wine. Just coca. And so Pemberton retreated to the lab once more, like a southern Sherlock with a headache and an unshakable entrepreneurial itch. After some tinkering, translation, removing the wine and adding a syrup, he emerged with a new formula, a carbonated version poured into soda fountains and served with just enough ceremony to distract from the lingering buzz. He called it Coca-Cola. Now remember, this wasn't yet the sugar festival we sip at picnics and movie theaters today. Early Coca-Cola had a personality, a tinge of tonic, it had bite, and yes, still a trace amount of cocaine. This wasn't your modern mocha frappuccino, it was a pharmacy visit in a glass. And speaking of pharmacies, that's exactly where Coca-Cola found its earliest fans. Soda fountains, nestled in the rear corners of drugstores, were becoming the Victorian-era equivalent of Starbucks. A place for refined society to gather and discuss the weather, rail rates, and possibly the suspicious smell of pickled onions wafting from the general store next door. The pharmacist, meanwhile, played the trusted role of part chef, part doctor, part confused bartender, serving up fizzing glasses of what many sincerely believed was good for the brain, the guts, and the spirit. It wasn't entirely misguided. There was caffeine to perk you up. Cocaine, in even modest doses, made people feel energetic, social, and strangely competent at things they'd never tried before, like conversational Latin or ballroom dancing. Mix those with sugar and water, and Pemberton had created the Victorian age elixir of life. My dear listener, let us pause here, for the lights of that old Atlanta apothecary are dimming, and the clink of soda glasses fades into the twilight. Dr. Pemberton, with his stovepipe hat and notebook full of syrup scribbles, didn't yet know that his humble mixture would one day surpass the boundaries of medicine altogether, that it would stop being a cure and start becoming a craving. But that is a tale best sipped slowly, like cola on a summer porch. Let's rest a moment more with the fizz still tickling our imagination, as our story, like a good tonic, continues to stir in the southern warmth of the 1880s, where magnolia blossoms perfumed the air and the porches squeaked beneath the slow swing of rocking chairs. There was a particular hush to an afternoon in Atlanta, a kind of dozy quiet broken only by the occasional cough, sigh, or faint exclamation of, "My rheumatism!" Because of course, people in the 1880s were perpetually afflicted with something vaguely Victorian. One such afflicted soul was a former Confederate colonel turned pharmacist named John Stith Pemberton, a man with a mustache as serious as his abdominal pains. Now, Colonel Pemberton's life had taken a few curious turns ever since the end of the Civil War. During the Battle of Columbus, he had been slashed with a saber, which sounds dashing until you learn that it left him in chronic pain and hooked on morphine, that nap time of narcotics. But Pemberton had the sort of mind that never quite sat still. Even in discomfort, it wandered the alchemy of apothecaries. He was a tinkerer of tinctures, a connoisseur of cough remedies, and a relentless believer that salvation could be found in just the right mixture, provided it also tasted nice. At the time, America was in the throes of a well-meaning but exceptionally enthusiastic medicinal craze. Everything was either a poison or a cure, and occasionally both. Doctors were prescribing heroin for anxiety and recommending smoking for digestion. The line between pharmacy and fantasy was thinner than a Victorian lady's lace glove. Pemberton, ever the innovator, decided that the world needed a new kind of miracle medicine, one that would boost energy, soothe nerves, cure headaches, and, with any luck, be palatable without holding one's nose. Thus began his experiments in his backyard lab, where clinking beakers and wafts of caramelized mystery drifted onto the summer breeze. The result? A deep mahogany syrup, rich and heady, combining African kola nut, a source of caffeine, Damiana, a supposed, well, let's call it a relationship tonic, and, here's the real kicker, extracts of coca leaf. Yes, the very same coca leaf whose name would later inspire federal crackdowns, edgy music albums, and several suspicious behavior patterns on Wall Street. But back then, coca was simply considered a delightful stimulant drawn from the bosom of Peru, helpful for everything from fatigue to exhausted masculinity, which was, apparently, a diagnosable condition. Pemberton called his creation Pemberton's French Wine Coca, because everything sounded more medicinal if it had French in the name. And wine, of course, because adding alcohol to something already bursting with caffeine and cocaine was merely part of the wellness trend. Now, in the genteel world of 19th century Atlanta, the tonic quickly gained favor. Locals found themselves sipping it for all manner of ills: headaches, melancholy, business meetings, even as a breakfast pick-me-up, which really puts your latte to shame. And thanks to Pemberton's marketing, which claimed it was a valuable brain tonic and, intriguingly, a cure for opium addiction, sales took off. There is some irony, of course, in selling a cocaine and alcohol cocktail as a way to stop taking opiates. But hey, it was the 1880s, a decade not overly burdened by scientific consensus. Things continued splendidly until 1886, when Atlanta passed a rather inconvenient new law, a citywide prohibition on alcohol. Because unfortunately, for the Dr. Pembertons of the world, the temperance movement had begun storming its moral teacups across the American South. Undeterred, Pemberton went back to his bubbling vats and sighing glassware and decided his potion needed a legal facelift. He swapped the wine for sugar and carbonated water, kept the Coca and the Cola, and voila, a new, sober-friendly elixir was born. It was now vaguely medicinal, vaguely legal, and delightfully fizzy. Some say this reformulated syrup struck the taste buds with a curious duality, slightly numbing yet invigorating, bitter yet sweet, like sipping a polite rebellion. Others just thought it was pretty good on ice. He named it Coca-Cola. Simple, catchy, and still riding on the coattails of its not-so-sober predecessor. The name sounded both exotic and trustworthy, like a patent medicine bottle blessed by both science and marketing. Not long after, he brought the recipe to a certain businessman named Willis Venable, who ran the soda fountain at Jacob's Pharmacy. They poured it over carbonated water to make it more refreshing, less syrupy. This was a stroke of accidental brilliance, the magical marriage of medicine and bubbles. On May 8, 1886, the first Coca-Cola was served to a customer who, we can only hope, ordered it with a straw and a puzzled eyebrow. And so the fizzy chapters of modern beverage history began, though at the time it was still largely shelved as a remedy, something to dispense with your daily dose of hopeful healing and caffeinated clarity. As the syrup flowed from pharmacy counters and soda jerks swapped ladles with ladylike laughter, a soft revolution was fizzing into life. And with that, our next turn will follow the curious fellow who would take Pemberton's peculiar potion and spin it into something the world would never again go without, in the warm, amber haze of American apothecaries during the late 19th century, a time when corsets were tight, mustaches were waxed, and mercury was inexplicably in everything there, sat a curious glass vessel behind the counter. Dark liquid, fragrant, bubbly, part tonic, part marvel, part mystery. A curiously animated beverage that seemed to whisper, "Yes, dear customer, I will fix whatever ails thee," perhaps too enthusiastically. Behind the counter stood a man in a white coat, which gave him the vague air of a doctor, though he likely had less medical training than your average houseplant. Still, he would nod gravely and say things like, "Yes, yes, fatigue, melancholy, lack of pep, all common. You need a dose of this invigorating elixir." And with the formality of a priest offering communion, he'd slide forth a glass of Coca-Cola. You see, during this time, people didn't so much sip soda as they did medically encounter it. Coca-Cola wasn't yet just a fizzy friend to popcorn or a suspiciously loyal companion to rum. Number. Back then, it lived in a different realm entirely, draped in hope, medicinal claims, and maybe just a sprinkle of marketing, sorcery. Now let's be fair, the world before modern medicine was, let's say, optimistically primitive. Electricity was still a novelty in houses. People thought bad air could cause illness, and if you sneezed in church, someone might offer you both a blessing and a tincture of laudanum. Into this swirling cauldron of incomplete science and utter exhaustion walked Atlanta pharmacist John Pemberton, a wounded Civil War veteran with an extremely practical goal: to invent the perfect morning pick-me-up. He had good reasons. Pemberton, like many veterans of the war, was addicted to morphine after being injured, and so he began concocting a series of nerve tonics to ease his own pain and, helpfully, maybe make a buck or two along the way. His first creation, Pemberton's French wine coca, a lovely little fusion of Bordeaux wine and coca leaf extract, which is to say, red wine plus cocaine. A dark beverage whose main side effect was probably intense ambition and a sudden desire to clean out all your kitchen cabinets at midnight. This, however, was perfectly legal. In fact, it was trendy. Having a little cocaine in your drink was, at the time, about as controversial as having a sugar cube in your tea. And so Pemberton marketed his tonic to the finer citizens of Atlanta as a cure-all. Headaches, anxiety, digestive troubles, the general grumpiness of being alive. It fixed them all. But politics intervened. In 1886, Atlanta, in a burst of teetotal enthusiasm, banned the sale of alcohol. Out went the wine, and Pemberton was forced to adjust the recipe. He replaced the wine with a sugary syrup base and kept the coca leaf, because really, what was medicine without a bit of invigorating alkaloid? And just like that, Coca-Cola was born. First as a fountain drink, served with a flourish of soda water in pharmacies, precisely where the weary and the wobbly wandered for relief. It was no accident that early advertising referred not to refreshment, but recovery. Names like the world's great temperance drink and the ideal brain tonic floated through old newspapers and shop signage. Coca-Cola was pitched not as something one might enjoy with a hamburger, but rather something one would receive following a discussion of one's spleen. And yes, back then, people talked about their spleens constantly. There's something quietly charming about those early advertisements. Illustrated women in tailored dresses gaze stoically into the distance, holding a glass of cola as if it were liquid destiny. Promises of vitality, mental clarity, and unrivaled energy pour forth from the print, like a sugar-powered sonnet. It relieves mental and physical exhaustion, they'd say, cures headache, dispels fatigue like dew before the morning sun. Physicians, most of whom had never heard of the placebo effect, but were firm believers in giving people stuff until they either felt better or passed out, began recommending Coca-Cola by name. And so it went. From pharmacy counters to household bottles. A creeping comfort, always within reach. Tonic became tonic with bubbles. Medicine became leisure. And somewhere deep in the fizz, a new kind of magic took hold. Next up, as the bubbles of this story continue to rise, we'll take a peek inside the back room of the pharmacy, where the magical syrup was actually being brewed, secrecy, sugar, and a pinch of scandal all included. In the golden glow of the 1890s, when America was still figuring out whether it wanted to be a rootin' frontier or a silk top hat sipping society, pharmacies were the place to be. And not for the aspirin. No, you went to the pharmacy in your fine woolen waistcoat, not because of a headache, but because you fancied a refreshing glass of bubbling brown medicine. And that medicine, naturally, was Coca-Cola. At this stage in its fizzy little life, Coca-Cola still had its original secret formula, and by secret, we mostly mean it hadn't legally been questioned yet. The two ingredients that made it so popular in the drugstore scene? Caffeine, and a delightful little extract known as cocaine. Yes, really. The drink sloshing in your marble-countered glass was more party than prescription, though doctors, bless them, wholeheartedly approved. Physicians of the era didn't quite have the tools we do today. MRIs, nope. Antibiotics, not really a thing yet. But you give a man in a bow tie a bottle of morphine, a modest moustache, and a few medical textbooks with sentences like, melancholia can be soothed with light narcotics, and suddenly, the world looks much brighter. Enter Coca-Cola, invented in 1886 by Dr. John Pemberton. We've mentioned him before, the wounded Confederate veteran, the opium-addicted chemist who wanted to kick a bad habit by creating a whole new brew of his own. And he created it all right, by blending coca leaf extract and cola nut with sweet syrup and carbonated water. Voila! Medicine, happiness, and possibly an accidental nightclub in your bloodstream. Doctors, none the wiser about the finer implications of regular cocaine ingestion, genuinely considered this bubbly concoction a miracle tonic. It was marketed for headache relief, of course, but also for fatigue, indigestion, depression, and this is a real kicker, for moral weakness, which, translated from 19th century medicalese, loosely meant, are you tired and sad because you have to put on pants every day? Try this. In those days, walking into a pharmacy was not unlike entering a stylish potion shop. Bottles lined the shelves like sleeping soldiers, labeled with quiet promises: soothe, enliven, restore. And perched atop the soda fountain, gleaming in the gaslight, was the mother of them all. Coca-Cola, served from behind the counter by friendly soda jerks in paper hats, who, despite the name, were usually much less jerky than you'd expect. A tall glass cost 5 cents. 1 nickel, about the price of a shoelace, or a sneeze, perhaps, today. And there was no pouring it into plastic bottles or cans, no busy vending machines or drive-thrus. If you wanted a Coca-Cola, you had to go out into the sunlight, tip your hat to a few strangers, open an oak door with jingly bells, and sit down on a stool that squeaked slightly on purpose, as though reminding you, yes, you're here, and also awake. Well, until the Coca-Cola kicks in. It was serious business. Doctors even handed out prescriptions for it. Imagine that, hoarding your little white slips of paper, knowing that tucked inside the scribbled Latin was not just your pathway to feeling better, but possibly the closest thing to a dance party the 1890s would allow in daylight. New mothers sipped it for nerves. Bank clerks drank it to keep their eyes open 8 hours straight. Writers liked it for inspiration, which might explain a few 19th century novels getting a bit, shall we say, wild in the middle. Now, it's worth noting that the amount of cocaine in early Coca-Cola was not enormous. We're not talking a Scarface pyramid of powder here, but there was enough to do what it promised: perk you up, goose your mood, and make you feel like capitalism was perhaps not that dreadful after all. Eventually, as science caught up and public eyebrows began to rise in unison, the drink's pharmaceutical credentials began to wobble. Authorities started raising pointed questions about the presence of, well, controlled substances in a children's beverage. But for a few glorious decades, people really and truly saw Coca-Cola as a doctor-endorsed miracle in a glass. A healing tonic right up there with castor oil and casual trepanning. And so, if you were ill in 1894, mentally weary or otherwise, and your doctor leaned over with his grandfatherly spectacles to whisper, "Drink a Coca-Cola." Twice a day, and with conviction, you did it. You drank, you fizzed, and you believed you were on the mend. Some even argued that the glass held hope, or sugar, but certainly something medicinal. Next, we'll find ourselves meandering into the world of temperance ladies, progressive reformers, and those brave souls who dared to ask, yes, but should soda get you slightly high? A gentle question for a slow-moving century, and a cozy topic to sip on, somewhere between the velvet hush of the Victorian parlour and the bustling clamour of the apothecary's back room. There brewed a syrup so mysterious and exciting it might as well have been bottled magic. And in some ways, it was. Though, not necessarily the kind of magic your grandmother would approve of. You see, by the late 1800s, pharmacists had become something like wizards of the high street, with starched collars instead of pointy hats, and mortar and pestles in place of wands. And in the kingdom of commercial concoctions, our handsome, effervescent friend Coca-Cola was ready for its next stage: legitimacy. With a capital L, pharmacists didn't just sell things. Oh no. They prescribed. That meant they could recommend a carbonated tonic for your headache, your heartbreak, or that thing you felt after eating too many oysters. If Coca-Cola was going to thrive, it needed allies in high places, or at least standing behind long walnut counters wearing gold-rimmed spectacles. Enter America's druggists, those frock-coated, mustachioed mixologists of medicine. They were busy converting powdered roots into cures and lightly carbonated sugar into hope. And when Coca-Cola arrived on the scene, shimmering with just enough coca leaf and cola nut to tickle your nerves and lift your spirits, many of them saw exactly what it was: a money-making miracle in a bottle, and possibly a handy remedy for whatever ailed the carefully corseted limbs of Atlanta society. Physicians had already begun scribbling new treatments with growing enthusiasm. And what do you know? Some of them started writing out advice like, try a daily glass of Coca-Cola, relieves fatigue, invigorates brain and body. Quite the endorsement. And while it may sound like the early drafts of an energy drink commercial, in 1890 that was practically a medical journal. Libraries of the time were filled with pamphlets that tossed around words like neurasthenia and melancholia, terms which covered, frankly, anything from existential dread to a mild cough. And Coca-Cola, it seemed, could fix it all, at least according to the ads written by copywriters wearing garters on their sleeves and chewing pencils down to hopeful nubs. It wasn't just patients who needed convincing, it was doctors. So Asa Candler, the savvy businessman who'd bought Coca-Cola's formula for a small pile of dough and a medium-sized ambition, struck gold by turning the brand into a prescribed tonic. He flooded pharmacies with syrup dispensers and handed out samples like an eager street magician inviting you to pick a card, any card, but in this case, drink a glass, feel reborn. And because word of mouth was the influencer of its time, society ladies began whispering at tea parties, "Have you tried that fizzy stuff down at the drugstore? My nerves haven't frayed all week." Children were given sips for stomachaches. Gentlemen recommended it as a post-luncheon pick-me-up. Ministers, though occasionally nervously adjusting their collars, didn't disapprove outright. The charm was in its category, confusion. Was it a medicine? A soft drink? A jar of optimism? Officially, it still carried the air of a medicinal tonic, even as it voluntarily lowered the cocaine content bit by bit, like a shy guest sneaking out of the party. That's right. By this time, the once celebrated coca leaf had started to earn a reputation. One the medical community couldn't quite ignore forever. Medical journals, after all, started raising faintly arched eyebrows. A few did blink at the sheer enthusiasm with which Coke was being dispensed. One doctor noted that patients appear quite uplifted after ingestion, perhaps too uplifted, he wrote rather solemnly. Another referred to it, be-moustached and bothered, as a beverage with significant incidents of recreational enjoyment, which in 1895 was basically a scandal. Still, the wave of carbonated adoration rolled on. Drugstores became less about medicine and more about soda fountains. Students skipped school for a dime's worth of sweetness. Entire romances began over shared straws, and many prescriptions for Coca-Cola continued to be written in 19th century cursive, so elaborate it might have required its own translator. And so, while physicians tiptoed between praise and peer pressure, Coca-Cola danced its fizzy waltz from pharmacy counters into the culture at large. No longer just a remedy, it was becoming a ritual, something normal, even nostalgic, like finding a piece of candy in your coat pocket or realizing your headache, for some reason, was kind of delightful. And now, as the fizz quiets and the pharmacist's shop closes for the evening, let us drift further into that twilight of Coca-Cola's golden age, just as competitors, imitators, and a few questionable cousins begin creeping in from the shadows. Meanwhile, in the wide, oak-paneled pharmacies of the late 19th century, where wallpaper was floral, mustaches were earnest, and men in bowler hats seemed to spend an alarming amount of time standing around doing absolutely nothing, a curious transformation was happening to the American beverage scene. No longer satisfied with mere sassafras-laced sarsaparilla or a humble glass of celery tonic. Yes, celery tonic for the soul. The patrons of the drugstore soda fountain were beginning to whisper about something more special. Something called Coca-Cola. And the whispers weren't just about the pleasant taste. It was about the feeling, a tingle, a lift, a sing-song in the sinews. Now, if you were a turn-of-the-century pharmacist, your job was a rather dashing cocktail of medicine, chemistry, and what we might call carbonated improvisation. These white-coated alchemists delighted in combining mysterious extracts in curious proportions, then marketing the results as reliable cures for almost anything that ailed you. Melancholy, indigestion, brain fog, unsolicited thoughts, or simply being too tired to button your shoes. So when a beverage came along that sparked not only joy, but also rumors of curative power, the pharmacy world did what any enterprising profession would. They latched onto it with the determination of a cat sensing tuna under the floorboards. Enter stage left. Coca-Cola, first brewed in 1886 by John Stith Pemberton, a pharmacist himself, who had a fondness for morphine, a sword wound, and a vision. At the time, the country was awash in patent medicines. Electric bitters, Dr. Pierce's, golden medical discovery, and the ever-popular Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. Spoiler, it contained morphine and made babies sleep forever, sometimes rather literally, lined the shelves. There was a tonic for every tic, a syrup for every sigh. Most formulas were closely guarded secrets, usually because if people knew what was in them, they might, well, stop drinking them. So when Pemberton introduced his syrupy elixir, he was simply joining a tradition that stretched back to medieval apothecaries, selling liquid hope in small glasses. His original formula contained, among other things, coca leaf extract and caffeine from cola nuts. Simple, efficient, mildly eyebrow-raising. Doctors, meanwhile, ever the pillars of society with their pocket watches and solemn foreheads, began to take notice. They were, to be fair, still in the flannel-shirted infancy of modern medicine. The medical profession was just beginning to tiptoe away from leeches and into the welcoming arms of charts and thermometers. In this world of uncertain science and certain coughs, a peppy brown beverage that made patients feel zesty was rather a blessing. It was marketed as a temperance drink, meaning it contained neither alcohol nor the promise of dancing scandalously in public. This made it palatable to decent society, and especially to women, who had long been excluded from more bacchanalian potions of the era. And so, with credibility lent by its supposed medicinal qualities, Coca-Cola found itself in an enviable position. Physicians themselves were writing prescriptions for it, not just proverbial ones either, actual lined paper instructions, bearing that dignified, spidery handwriting that suggests the diagnosis of either a cold or perhaps the end of civilization. The ailments Coca-Cola was meant to soothe. Oh, just the usual turn-of-the-century maladies. Neurasthenia, a mysterious fatigue invented by exhausted Victorians. Melancholia, headaches, tired nerves, indigestion, and, of course, female complaints. A catch-all diagnosis popular with genteel doctors and disinterested husbands. One Atlanta doctor was said to have literally prescribed Coca-Cola to patients not for its stimulating properties, but because it was better tolerated than bitters and did not cause belching. High praise indeed. Meanwhile, behind the counters of those elaborately mirrored soda fountains, soda jerks, so called for the deft pull of the soda handle, became the unofficial therapists of the common people, doling out fizzy medicine with a side of social commentary and occasional flirtation. People didn't just sip Coca-Cola, they imbibed optimism, one bubble at a time. And as the demand grew, so too did the law. Coca-Cola was no longer just a pleasure, it was practically a Protestant virtue, a cure you could sip while reading Emerson, listening to parlor music, or writing yet another letter to your Aunt Mabel about the recent excellence of your bile. But this sugary savior, for all its enthusiasm, was also changing. Because while doctors prescribed it and pharmacists sold it, somewhere in the amber dusk of American history, a cold wind started to blow through the world of Coca-Cola. A wind made of lawsuits, reformers, and one deadly question. What exactly is in this stuff? And who, pray tell, keeps getting rid of the cocaine? As the curtain of the 1890s draped over American society like a velvet parlor curtain trimmed with tassels, a curious transformation was unfolding in pharmacies across the land. This wasn't about medical breakthroughs involving microbes or antiseptics. No, ma'am, we're talking about soda fountains. Yes, soda fountains. Those gleaming counters with shiny taps and clinks of porcelain mugs. You'd swear they were just for root beer floats and awkward teenage flirting, but back then, they were the shrines of early medicinal enthusiasm and marketing wizardry. See, by this time, Coca-Cola was no longer just a tonic sold from behind the counter to the weary and the woozy. It was emerging into something more public, more effervescent, something that fizzed both in the glass and in the imagination, and the pharmacy soda fountain was its chapel. Let me paint you a picture. You needed something for your nervous system, which was 19th century code for being slightly stressed, mildly alive, or possibly having to talk to your in-laws. So you'd wander into your local apothecary. A mustachioed gentleman in a spotless white coat would nod gravely and ask, "What troubles you, friend?" "My humors are unbalanced," you'd say with exhausted conviction, though what that meant was anyone's guess. He'd pause solemnly, open a drawer, extract a generous glug of syrup from an unmarked bottle marked Invigoration, and add it to a frosted glass of soda water drawn straight from a brass spigot. The syrup, you see, was Coca-Cola concentrate, something doctors had only recently begun calling a valuable alimentary adjunct, which in plain English meant drinkable, possibly helpful, tastes fantastic. And so, you sipped. And sip you did. Because oh my, that stuff was good. It had cola nut for kick, coca leaf for, well, a slightly narcotic wink, and a blend of mysterious flavorings known only to a handful of mortals, and probably one raccoon if we're being imaginative. Around this time, physicians, those fine lords of learned guesses, began to take a new look at psyched-up sodas like Coca-Cola and whispered something particularly dangerous. This might be medicine. The logic was exquisite in its shakiness. Patients were stressed. Coca-Cola made them feel less stressed. Therefore, it was therapeutic. Add to that a firm belief in digestive tonics, and somehow prescription Coca-Cola wormed its way onto actual remedy lists. In small towns, doctors would scribble out little notes saying essentially, "Take Coca-Cola as needed." And pharmacists, who were trained in both compounding drugs and elaborate mustache care, would happily oblige, knowing full well the customer left happier than they'd entered. Not because of any miracle cure, but because Coca-Cola, it turned out, was really fun to drink. And in a time when medicine often tasted like burned shoe polish and made your ears ring, that alone was enough to inspire loyalty, praise, and repeat visits. By 1895, promotional ads were leaning into this identity with the subtlety of a brass band in a moonlit meadow. "Delicious and refreshing," they sang, in curlicue fonts big enough to knock over a mule. "Exhilarates the body and mind," exclaimed others, as if suggesting Coca-Cola could single-handedly save you from both indigestion and existential dread. It didn't help that Coca-Cola's closest competitors were still offering syrups with names like Nerve Juice and Intestinal Elixir No. 3, which sounded about as luxurious as a lecture on hay fermentation. Coca-Cola, on the other hand, sounded like something you could drink while wearing a hat you actually liked. Doctors weren't just prescribing it, they were quietly enjoying it. Some would take a mid-morning refresher, a genteel euphemism for sipping the very stuff they'd told Old Man Jenkins was helpful for his melancholy. Never mind the fact that the drink still contained trace amounts of cocaine at the time. Not enough to send you galloping down the street, mind you. Just enough to make you slightly friendlier to your neighbor's poultry. And so, the soda fountain became the unlikely meeting place of medicine, marketing, and mischief. A bubbling intersection of pseudoscience and genuine delight. By this point, no one could really say where the pharmacy ended and the cafe began. Was it a place of health? A social club? or simply a place to sit and chat while sipping history through a marrow-chilling straw. Yes, it was all those things. And for now, no one seemed to mind the blurring lines. The air was sweet, the bubbles danced, and the nation's collective humours felt, at least temporarily, quite well balanced indeed. But in the distance, nearly inaudible beneath the hiss of seltzer and the clutter of teaspoons, the wheels of regulation were beginning to squeak into motion as the 1890s ushered in all the usual trappings of a modernizing America, trains puffing across landscapes, telegrams crackling with miscommunication, and women's skirts silently getting just a hair more scandalous. There was one thing, above all, that refused to be left behind by time: patent medicine. Ah, yes, the word patent here did not mean these concoctions were officially registered or approved by anyone respectable. It simply suggested that someone, somewhere, had put their name on it, and then cleverly made sure no one could verify any of the ingredients. It was into this laissez-faire apothecary jungle that Coca-Cola strutted like a well-dressed charlatan at a county fair. With its delicate fizz, mysterious ingredients, and whisper of wellness, it was marketed as a tonic for all sorts of common 19th century ailments, including, but not limited to, fatigue, headaches, melancholy, excessive book reading, and the occasional case of being rather too ordinary. But while the beverage could still be bought from soda fountains, something odd was brewing inside the consultations of many doctors' offices. You see, around this time, physicians, those noble interpreters of mysterious bellyaches, began prescribing Coca-Cola. And not just anecdotally. No. Some doctors actually wrote it on paper, often in their finest quill penmanship. RX, Coca-Cola, 3 times a day, with meals or your mother-in-law. Now, to be fair, the reasoning behind this wasn't entirely ludicrous for the era. Coca-Cola contained 2 ingredients that had the medical community's teacups in a tremble of excitement: caffeine and cocaine. The caffeine, derived from cola nuts, promised to pep up your pulse without entirely exploding it. The cocaine extracted from coca leaves was, in 1894, not yet burdened by its modern reputation. Back then, it was seen as a sort of soulful pick-me-up, something to brighten your gloom, boost your productivity, and perhaps help you shoot off a few extra telegrams at lightning speed. People were not yet entirely ready for the concept of moderation. Coca-Cola, by modern standards, had enough stimulating goodness to send a sleepy Victorian into a rather lively rendition of a Virginia reel. So, was it truly medicine? Well, in that curious pre-FDA age, almost anything could be medicine if one carried a sincere mustache and could hold a bottle dramatically against the light. If your neighbor's cousin sold it in his pharmacy and the label had curly font and promised to invigorate your liver, it was as good as gospel. Local. Apothecaries carried Coca-Cola syrup in medicinal jars tucked between opium tincture and Dr. Piney Root's all-natural snake oil, which was presumably made with 0% snake. Doctors sometimes prescribed it to children showing signs of neurasthenia, a now-retired diagnosis which essentially meant being tired of modern life, the mail, or overly stern wallpaper. Coca-Cola became the panacea of choice for faint hearts, poor digestion, and any case in which the patient seemed a touch peaky. And when Johnny, the office clerk, felt overcome with what might now be called existential dread, Dr. Whipple down the road might suggest a dose of Coca-Cola, or possibly a vacation involving sulfur springs and absolutely no thinking. Even newspapers caught into the charm, occasionally endorsing the drink as a remedy beneficial for all gentlemen and fainting ladies. Farmers sipped it for stamina in ploughing their vast cornfields, and traveling salesmen swore by it as the only cure for an overly long train ride and a too large mustache. It wasn't just doctors and pharmacists who joined the fizzy fever. Some clever marketing minds nudged Coca-Cola into doctors' waiting rooms, distributing posters and pamphlets, many of which featured impossibly cheerful patients dabbling in activities like seated badminton or dramatic piano reading. These visuals were the eternal portrait of glowing health, achieved certainly by enjoying an invigorating glass of Coca-Cola and not by taking long walks or eating anything green. There was even an official push in some areas to get the syrup stocked as a prescription default, meaning if someone had a perfectly ordinary cold, there was no need for the fuss of real treatment. A bottle of Coca-Cola at the corner drugstore could have them feeling euphoric and slightly immortal by early evening. And so it was, amid marble counters and flickering oil lamps, that Coca-Cola slipped itself into the White Coat Club. Not with the credentials of science, perhaps, but unarguably with charisma. It was medicine not because it passed clinical trials, but because people wanted it to be. It was tasty, bubbly, slightly illegal, and had the enduring advantage of not being castor oil. But what happens when a few states begin wondering whether a doctor's prescription should depend quite so heavily on fizzy stimulants? When clever pharmacists start asking perhaps too many questions? Well, that curious little reckoning was beginning to bubble just under the surface. But we can let it rise slowly, like a gentle glass of syrup being stirred with sleepy thoughts. While the world was enjoying this fizzy new medicine called Coca-Cola, tipping glasses at drugstore counters, chatting cheerily as bubbles tickled their upper lips, a quiet transformation was happening across the prescriptions pads of well-meaning but occasionally over-enthusiastic physicians. By the mid-1890s, Coca-Cola had crept its way into the world of serious medical conversation. No longer just a refreshing novelty, it was being held up as a therapeutic panacea for everything from headaches to hysteria to digestive ennui. And yes, digestive ennui was very real, a condition wherein one's stomach simply couldn't be bothered. You see, this was a time when medical science still walked with a bit of a limp. Doctors had not quite distinguished the difference between sugar syrup and elixir of life, and in fairness, neither had most patients. So when a doctor scribbled down a note saying, "Give the patient a tumblerful of Coca-Cola twice daily," you'd better believe the pharmacist took it seriously. At the heart of this prescription craze was a set of active ingredients that read less like a beverage label and more like the guest list for a turn-of-the-century snake oil convention. The original Coca-Cola, as you likely driftily recall, contained 2 vaudevillian headliners, an extract of coca leaves, yes, those coca leaves, and cola nut. A pairing that could wake up the doer and unblock the unusually blocked. And thus it began. Coca-Cola was not simply something you drank, it was something you were told to drink by someone in a white coat and polished spectacles. Doctors found a certain elegance in the way Coca-Cola straddled the line between beverage and cure-all. For nervous disorders, it was recommended due to the stimulating qualities of caffeine. For fatigue, well, it percolated through your bloodstream faster than an afternoon nap. And for headaches, it may have worked mostly by making you feel delightfully, distractingly bubbly. One New Orleans physician, writing in a medical journal in 1896, declared that Coca-Cola had showed encouraging results in melancholic women who have drifted into the habit of loafing. One must wonder how the melancholic women felt about this conclusion, but either way, they likely felt zippier after a glass or two. In pharmacies, Coca-Cola now had a reputation nearly as lofty as that of cod liver oil, except tangerine sweet and infinitely less fishy. Pharmacists dispensed it in dark amber bottles, tucked gently into paper bags, with instructions like, "Consume when symptoms of dreariness persist." There was something effortlessly medicinal about it. You didn't question the efficacy of a drink served from an ornate soda fountain with brass fixtures, especially when offered by a man in a bow tie who looked vaguely like he moonlighted as a magician. Even the advertisements leaned into the science of it all. "The ideal brain tonic," read one early poster, featuring a stern university professor sipping from a tall glass with a look of deep concentration, possibly because his eyebrows were doing most of the acting. By this time, Coca-Cola had entered a sort of medical mythology. People didn't just believe in it, they depended on it. It was the remedy for poor work ethic, sluggish bookkeeping, fainting spells, and that ambiguous catch-all, the blues. Depression? Have a Coke. Your entire mood would audibly fizz back into shape. Children were not exempt. Pediatricians could be found advising parents to introduce Coca-Cola in small quantities to supposedly listless toddlers, an early case of giving small humans big energy they absolutely did not require at that hour of the evening. Of course, most doctors had no ill will. They were prescribing Coca-Cola the same way contemporary physicians might prescribe rest or hydration or just go outside and touch a tree. It was seen as wholesome, even medicinally charming. But as Coca-Cola's fame bubbled toward the 20th century, new eyes began watching it less dreamily and more critically. Public health officials, moral reformers, and, not least, those pesky journalists stopped just sipping and started asking questions. What, exactly, is in this? They inquired with cautious eyebrows. Now, dear listener, let your thoughts fizz away like tiny carbonated bubbles ascending the inside of a glass. As the late-century sunlight filters through stained glass pharmacy windows, we begin to overhear the earliest grumblings of regulatory reform. The charmingly unregulated days of Coca-Cola prescriptions were not to last forever. But for a little while longer, the drink maintained its place right there on the shelf, between your grandmother's laudanum and your father's moustache tonic. And somewhere, a doctor with impeccable handwriting was still signing off. Take one bottle and call me in the morning, preferably from a payphone near a soda fountain. Let's gently wander closer now, to the next quiet revelation, where cola met controversy, and the government started reading labels, perhaps for the very first time. By the spring of 1905, the so-called miracle elixirs of the 19th century were beginning to feel slightly less miraculous. The problem wasn't that they stopped working. Exactly. It was more that the public had begun to realize that perhaps they hadn't really started working in the first place. Sure, Grandma's arthritis seemed better after a spoonful of Go-Go Tonic No. 7, but that may have had more to do with the generous helping of alcohol mixed with heroin and a dash of peppermint oil than any targeted healing properties. The patient didn't so much improve as forget they were mortal for a few hours. Into this world, still wobbling between quackery and progress, marched the beginnings of something new. Regulation. Yes, regulation. The not-so-sexy hero of our story, riding in like a librarian with a clipboard and a mission. Now, don't get too excited. This was still a time when snake oil salesmen had business cards and suits. But in 1906, a remarkably sleepy-sounding piece of legislation would change things forever. The Pure Food and Drug Act. Oh, the Pure Food and Drug Act. Less thrilling than a bar brawl, but far more medically effective. This wasn't just a dry piece of congressional paperwork. It was a full-blown buzzkill for every medicine man selling extract of yak pancreas as a cure for heartbreak. And it came at the insistence of increasing public outcry. Groups of fierce women's clubs, worried scientists, and a little spicy literary push from a man named Upton Sinclair, whose novel, The Jungle, described the meatpacking industry with all the charm of a horror movie run through a meat grinder. Now, technically, Sinclair was trying to reform labor practices, not pharmaceuticals. But people grew so nauseated by his descriptions of sausages stuffed with, let's call them, ingredients of diverse origin, that suddenly Uncle Sam decided maybe it was time to check the labels on everything. This meant for the first time, companies like Coca-Cola had to actually say what was in their bottle, a revolutionary concept. Coca-Cola, by now, was a massive name. It was the houseguest that had moved into every pharmacy, soda fountain, and parlor room across America. But until the Pure Food and Drug Act, it didn't have to provide any actual list of ingredients. It could just smile mysteriously from its green glass bottle and claim to make your nerves sing lullabies. When the federal inspectors came sniffing around to see whether any unapproved substances were lounging in your cherry phosphate or cough cordial, Coca-Cola had a bit of a dilemma. You see, by this stage in our tale, the Coca in Coca-Cola was becoming slightly problematic. Originally a nod to the coca leaf, the same plant that gives us cocaine, the company had begun gradually reducing its cocaine content a few years prior. But that doesn't mean it was zero exactly. There were still trace amounts. Sub-therapeutic levels, as a modern marketer might say with a straight face. This trace cocaine issue attracted the attention of one very determined US attorney named Harvey Washington Wiley. Wiley was a relentless man, the kind of guy who could give a lecture on paprika purity and have you on the edge of your seat. He led what he called the Poison Squad, a heroic band of government-employed volunteers who willingly consumed questionable chemicals to see what would happen. Yes, they were paid to eat additives, and yes, this was considered progress. Wiley had strong feelings about truth in labeling and stronger feelings about Coca-Cola's caffeine content. Forget cocaine. By now, it was the caffeine that kept his lab coat flapping in righteous outrage. He was convinced Coca-Cola was turning America's youth into twitchy insomniacs with weak moral compasses. His words, not mine. And so, in 1911, the United States versus 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola commenced. That was the actual name of the case. Very specific, extremely dramatic. Picture barrels trembling nervously as lawyers pace the courtroom floor. The government's case wasn't about the sugar, the bubbles, or even the whisper of narcotic residue. It was entirely about caffeine. Wiley's team claimed the added caffeine was a harmful additive and that Coca-Cola was falsely advertising itself as a brain tonic when what it really offered was a one-way ticket to bedtime rebellion. Coca-Cola, naturally, disagreed. The trial teetered between absurd and revolutionary. Scientists argued over caffeine's effects. Lawyers tried to define what brain tonic meant. At one point, the court was treated to the testimony of schoolchildren known as Coca-Cola drinkers, a phrase that conjured images of kids in monocles sipping soda in smoky jazz clubs. In the end, the court ruled in favor of Coca-Cola. Sort of. The judge decided caffeine wasn't dangerous enough to warrant seizure, but did tell the company to be more, shall we say, transparent. And so began a new age. An age where sodas had to admit what they were, where tonics had to grow up and get proper resumes, and where sleepy Americans could finally sip their brown bubbly treat, knowing just a little bit more about what was swirling around in each carbonated micro-symphony. Of course, this didn't mean the world instantly became rational overnight. No, not even close. For as one world of patents and puffery faded, another was just brewing in the bright, neon-lit future of 20th century advertising. In the early decades of the 20th century, before the world had quite decided whether it preferred morphine or malted milkshakes, pharmacies occupied a peculiar corner of public life. They were not just places where people went to have their prescriptions filled or to pick up a mysterious bottle labeled tonic, whose contents fizzed suspiciously. They were social sanctuaries, gathering places, purveyors of both remedies and root beer floats. And perhaps no piece of furniture was more iconic in this era than the soda fountain. Now, if you're picturing the kind of soda fountain with spinning red, stools and teens nervously sipping through two straws, you're a few decades too late. The soda fountains of the early 1900s were brass-trimmed altars to effervescence run by soda jerks, not because they were rude, but because they jerked the soda handles in swift, practiced motion. Picture young men in white aprons concocting bubbly brews from sparkling water, flavored syrups, and, yes, the occasional splash of medicinal elixir that the average modern physician would not touch with a 10-foot stethoscope. Because you see, in the golden age of pharmacy meets dessert, Coca-Cola wasn't merely a refreshment, it was a treatment, a tonic, a remedy for headaches, hangovers, hysteria, and a general lack of pep. The precise condition, lack of pep, had not yet made it into the medical lexicon, but doctors, and soda jerks frankly, recognized it everywhere. In small towns and big cities alike, patrons would sidle up to the marble countertop, elbows perched, and ask in hushed tones what the good pharmacist had behind the counter for their exhaustion or melancholia. With a knowing nod, the pharmacist might gesture toward the bubbling tap and ask, "How about a nice Coca-Cola?" Just what the doctor ordered, and they were only half joking. This was a time when pharmacists were part chemist, part therapist, part bartender, and all swagger. They could mix compounds and comfort your nerves, then top it all off with a sprig of mint and a straw. And unlike today's pharmacies, where the most exciting thing might be a discounted bottle of vitamin D, these drugstores offered sparkling apothecaries of hope. You could chase your depression away with cherry phosphate, cure your heartbreak with a butterscotch soda. And if your symptoms lingered, well, they had something a little stronger for that too, neatly dosed in syrup and carbonated with confidence. Coca-Cola's medicinal reputation wasn't just good marketing, it was backed by the sheer force of belief. Remember, this was also the age of electric belts, radium water, and corsets, tight enough to turn bones into origami. People weren't allergic to trying things. If it tingled, fizzed, or made your ears hum just a little bit, it was probably helping. But here's where it became particularly charming. Mothers genuinely prescribed their children Coca-Cola for complaints ranging from fatigue to too quiet afternoons. Doctors didn't object. In some cases, they encouraged it. After all, it had a pleasant taste, gave you a pick-me-up and, if you looked at the ingredients list closely, still included coca leaf extract with its lightly invigorating whisper of cocaine. It was, quite literally, a brain tonic, and that made it respectable. Of course, this respectability didn't mean everyone agreed. There were mothers-in-law who disapproved, temperance societies that murmured darkly about the moral risks of fizzy pleasure, and physicians who harumphed about dilution of medical standards by the likes of sugar and syrup. But still, Coca-Cola flowed with unabashed elegance from soda fountain spigots across the nation, and as far as anyone could tell, it made people feel better, at least long enough to come back for another glass the next afternoon. The soda fountain became the town's pulse, humming with life, laughter, and gentle placebo. Children came for the sweetness, adults came for the exhale, and nestled in the copper pipes and porcelain mugs was a curious blend of chemistry and comfort, caffeine and hope. Somewhere between science and storytelling, a nation drank its way into believing. And so, the line between doctor and soda jerk blurred just a little more, and would remain blurry right up until things started to fizzle in more ways than one. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's linger just a moment longer at that counter. Let the clink of glass and fizz of carbonated bubbles lull us further into the dream. After all, what came next was enough to make even the jolliest pharmacist raise an eyebrow, and perhaps stir his syrup with a more cautious spoon. As the clocks of the Gilded Age ticked steadily on, and moustaches grew with inexplicable confidence across the upper lips of American gentlemen, the great experiment of medicinal soda continued bubbling away. In the softly lit pharmacies of the 1890s, with their varnished oak shelves lined with glass bottles, all glistening like treasure chests of questionable cures, a peculiar ritual emerged. It was called the soda fountain consultation. Yes, there was a time, not terribly long ago, if you ask a grandfather clock, when your neighborhood pharmacist was not only your go-to for stomach upset, but also your local mixologist, and not the artisanal, tattooed, beard-oiling kind. No, these pharmacists were pioneers of the carbonated frontier, wearing starched white jackets and carefully stirring syrups that claimed, quite sincerely, to cure melancholy, neuralgia, and that vague but ever-popular affliction, female trouble. Picture it. You wander into a drugstore in Savannah or Chicago wearing a corset or a bowler hat, depending on your mood and anatomy. You're feeling a bit off. Not sick, necessarily, just out of sorts. Your energy is sluggish, your spirits a bit droopy, and maybe your toe has been acting up. The pharmacist greets you like an old friend, because he is, and offers a glass of something invigorating. And what do you sip? A fizzy tonic containing, surprise, a modest amount of cocaine. Ah, yes. Once again, we find ourselves in that curious era when cocaine was considered less of a controlled substance and more of a controlled solution, preferably mixed with caramel syrup and served over crushed ice. One of the most charming byproducts of this fizzy phase was the invention of tonic etiquette, which wasn't so much an official code as a shared understanding that you should sit quietly while your nervous system was rebooted by bubbly enthusiasm in a glass. There was a kind of hush at the pharmacy counter. Strangers sipped side by side, watching the bubbles rise like the thoughts of overworked Victorians finally lifting toward the light. Coca-Cola had entered the fray by now, of course, not merely as a delicious carbonated delight, but as a restorative elixir. Advertisements whispered sweet promises: energy, clarity, renewal, and in the fine print, no hangover. You could trust anything printed next to a drawing of a woman in a bonnet holding a parasol and smiling vaguely into the distance. Doctors, yes, actual physicians with diplomas and occasionally monocles, began to prescribe Coca-Cola for everything from indigestion to fatigue to what one journal called hot weather exhaustion. And who among us has not collapsed beneath the tyranny of a humid July? The logic went like this. Coca-Cola contained coca leaf extract, that's the cocaine bit, a caffeine-laden cola, nut, and enough sugar to fund a small wasp commune. Medicine, right? Sweet, perky, addictive medicine. One Georgia doctor even penned an open letter stating that he had recommenced prescribing Coca-Cola to his patients after noticing it brightened their dispositions significantly, which is probably an old-fashioned way of saying, they stopped glaring at me and started writing me thank you notes in cursive. To drink a Coca-Cola in those days wasn't to indulge. It was to engage in an act of self-care, albeit the kind that might cause you to reorganize your entire kitchen alphabetically at midnight. Children drank it after school. Elderly men sipped it before playing checkers. Ministers offered it to mourners with the solemn air of a Eucharist. It was, depending on who you asked, a divine beverage, a scientific breakthrough, or possibly witchcraft in a bottle. This era also gave birth to the traveling tonic man, a kind of soda evangelist who rode from town to town with a suitcase full of fizzy morality and fancier adjectives than a Victorian thesaurus. He didn't just sell Coca-Cola, he extolled it. He treated it like holy water, handed out in tulip-shaped cups. He hailed it as a universal panacea, gentler than opium, cheaper than a doctor, and far more likely to make you smile at strangers in the street. And in those dreamy, carbonated moments, everyone seemed to believe him. It was a golden age of bubbles and belief, stirred together with hope, and just a dash of plausible deniability. Of course, not everyone raised their glass to toast. In quieter corners, a tide of skepticism was beginning to fizz. Softly, of course, but as long as the drinks were cold and the claims were warm. Who could argue with a miracle in a bottle? After all, it wasn't just soda, it was science, with a splash of sugar. And as the sun sets behind another marble-pillared apothecary, let us follow the rising aroma of curiosity into what happened when the tonic men met their match, a new kind of reformer, with just as much determination and considerably less fondness for fizz, in the softly glowing gaslight of the late 1890s, as ladies bustled their way down cobbled sidewalks and gentlemen proudly twirled their moustaches like antennae to the future. A curious thing swept the streets of American cities. Soda fountains were becoming the place to be seen, assuming your idea of a wild evening included sipping a bubbly tonic and discussing the invigorating effects of phosphoric acid. And perched triumphantly behind every marble counter in these soda sanctuaries was a new kind of celebrity, the soda jerk. Part alchemist, part barista, and all elbow grease. Dressed in pristine white jackets and paper caps that could balance a spoonful of dignity, these young men yanked the levers and stirred the syrups that produced fizzy miracles. Among their arsenal of effervescent delight was Coca-Cola, the not-so-secret medicinal marvel we've come to know and, at one time, be prescribed during bouts of the vapors. Now, dear dreamer, these weren't your corner diner soda jerks idle between milkshakes. Oh no, at the dawn of the 20th century, soda jerks knew more about human morale than entire councils of city mayors. A skilled soda jerk could lift the spirits of a tired shoe clerk, fortify a lovesick librarian, and deliver cola-soaked encouragement to hat salesmen having existential crises. Not to mention they were unwitting pharmacists of the bootstrapped beverage industry. Here's where it gets tastefully fizzy. Coca-Cola wasn't just one more drink behind the counter. In the eyes of many, it was a medicine, a pulp tonic, a fizzy fix-all. At the time, it still contained trace amounts of actual coca leaf extract, blissfully unburdened by today's stern federal opinions on stimulant usage. Doctors, perhaps worn thin from endless cases of ennui, or from being unable to cure anything more complicated than an earache, began prescribing Coca-Cola like it was divine syrup. Feeling tired? Coca-Cola. Feeling anxious? Coca-Cola. Missing your train and contemplating the pointlessness of time? Better have a double. And here's a deliciously ironic twist. By the end of the 1890s, pharmacies were among the most popular spots to grab a Coca-Cola. That's right. Individuals in waistcoats and petticoats would stroll into drugstores, not for painkillers or plasters, but for a chilled glass of medicinal carbonation topped with a curl of ice. The line between medicine and refreshment had never been blurrier or bubblier. For all their efforts, many soda jerks took their duties like an honor bestowed. They polished their brass fixtures. They kept their mustaches at socially acceptable curl ratios. They knew your name, your favorite mixture of syrup to sparkle, and just how much to tilt the glass as they pulled the lever to avoid fizz chaos. This was chemistry of the human soul. Of course, behind the counter, the bottles and syrups were multiplying like mischievous rabbits. Cherry phosphate, sarsaparilla root, celery tonic for those suffering from insufficient vegetable feelings. And around 1903, when Coca-Cola's coca content began to shift toward the decaffeinated persuasion of the leaf, perhaps to appease the prim and proper pedants of early drug regulation, soda jerks carried on mixing their elixirs and reassuring patrons that, stimulant or not, the bubbles still made the heart sing. The idea that a soda could be both recreational and restorative struck a particular chord with a public craving modernity and novelty. Unlike other medicines of the time, snail syrup for sore throats, or turpentine poultices for nightmares, Coca-Cola was pleasant. It didn't taste like swamp regret. It didn't require heating on the stove or fetching special herbs from a cousin who knew a witch. You just sat, ordered your glass, and sipped your way into a deliciously carbonated future. In many small towns, that sparkling glass at the drugstore counter was the day's highlight. Patrons took their time. Swirls in the drink were considered small constellations. Burps were more of a gentle acknowledgement to the beverage gods than anything impolite. It was society, science, and soda, all frothed up in one grand libation. And as the days rolled on, and the bow tie of progress tightened a little more each year, one couldn't help but marvel at how a simple syrup in a glass had become America's favorite kind of remedy, served with a smile, chilled with crushed ice, and dispensed with medical-ish authority by the gentle heroes of the marble counter. Now that the soda fountain bubble is gently fizzing in your imagination, let's slowly meander into the next effervescent development, where entrepreneurial ambitions and courtroom drama would battle over bottles, bubbles, and the ever-growing question, who really owned the fizz? As the calendar curled its edges into the early 1900s, and corsets still gripped humanity like overzealous hugs from behind, Coca-Cola was no longer just a pharmacy curiosity. It was becoming fashionable, not merely medicinal now, no, but stylish. A fizzy status symbol, like monocles for the throat. You didn't just sip Coca-Cola to fend off your latest bout of ennui or fainting spells. You sipped it because it made you look terribly modern. And it was suddenly everywhere. In soda fountains at apothecaries, certainly, but also creeping into cafes, train stations, and the polite corners of parlor society. Ladies in lace gloves and gents in straw boaters would clink chilled glasses of Coke with all the romance of a garden party. And if you listened closely, you could almost hear the carbonation saying, "Yes, darling, we're terribly sophisticated." Of course, Coca-Cola still officially maintained its identity as medicine. This was, after all, a time when marketers couldn't simply say, "Drink our product because it's delicious and vaguely addictive." They needed a reason. And the best reason of all: health. Vague, shimmering health. The advertisements took on the poetry of ailment. Coca-Cola cures headache, exhaustion, neuralgia, melancholia. If your condition sounded like something from a Bronte novel, it probably meant you needed a glass of Coke. Got nerves? Try Coca-Cola. Can't sleep? Of course. Too many toxins in your system. Coke will flush them out. Quote-unquote soda jerks, who were not emotional staff but cheerful clerks serving carbonated beverages, became impromptu therapists. They'd mix your glass with a side of diagnosis. "Rough day, sir. Sound like nerve tonic to me." A short pause. Coca-Cola coming right up. Meanwhile, the good Dr. Pemberton had long passed on into the fizzy afterlife, having sold the formula before its true fame. But his successor, Asa Candler, a businessman with nothing but strategy in his bloodstream, was transforming the brand from a local curiosity into a national addiction. His approach was simple: give away the syrup to pharmacy counters, charge later. Who could refuse free bubbly medicine? With marketing zest that bordered on prophetic, Candler blanketed the nation's walls and wagons with the name. Coca-Cola signs appeared on barns, awnings, pocket mirrors, and, should you desire a reminder mid-prayer, even church fans. At this point, it's estimated 9 out of 10 Americans had, at minimum, seen the name Coca-Cola, if not tasted its medicinal elegance. Colleges were next. Candler, wise in the ways of future consumers, placed vending fountains in universities, essentially introducing exhausted students to stimulant-toned soft drinks decades before the invention of finals-related anxiety. And yes, it still contained cocaine. Around this time, maybe not in industrial quantities, but enough to make you feel like perhaps you weren't irritable and tired after all. Perhaps you were brimming with passion potential, with vitality, with a suspiciously twitchy optimism. Coca-Cola straddled the border between cure and refreshment with the casual elegance of someone loitering at a garden gate. Nobody quite knew whether they were remedying their bodies or indulging their palates, and nobody seemed to terribly care. It tasted good. It felt good. People weren't asking questions yet. Meanwhile, doctors remained in a moral quandary. Many still recommended it. After all, what else offered relief for toothaches, menstrual cramps, and a general feeling of fogginess? Could peppermint oil do that? Hardly. Coca-Cola was a reliable panacea, an umbrella for your soul on those metaphorically rainy Victorian days. And so patients kept sipping, often while reclining in fainting chairs, sighing at the heavens, perhaps whispering poetry about carbonated hope. It's hard to say just where innocence turned to influence, but somewhere between the velvet couch of therapy and the marble counter of retail, Coca-Cola stepped over a blurry line. But that's how many revolutions begin. Not with a bang, but with a fizz. And just behind the curtain of this gentle bubble bath in American commerce, something new was brewing. Not just in Atlanta or in pharmacies, but in Washington, D.C., where a few stern eyebrows had started to rise. But for now, the syrup continued to flow, the bubbles danced, and the public, glass in hand, sipped eagerly, still thinking, perhaps, that they were healing. The next phase, however, would ask uncomfortable questions about just how healing 7 teaspoons of sugar and a whisper of cocaine could be. By the turn of the century, Coca-Cola had woven itself quite snugly into the very fabric of American society, like a sparkling thread of carbonation bubbling gently through the nation's bloodstream. And yet, even as it nestled comfortably in soda fountains and pharmacy shelves, the drink's identity remained suspiciously flexible. It was, depending on who you asked, either a delicious refreshment, a cure-all tonic, or something that might jumpstart your nervous system into light jazz hands. But 1903 brought a change of winds, a kind of whispered shift in how the nation viewed its favorite fizzy miracle. You see, the star ingredient, the one that gave the drink both its name and its original verve, was cocaine. Not in a metaphorical sense. Coca-Cola, for several early years, really and truly contained cocaine. Trace amounts, of course, though how tracy those traces were is still debated in scholarly circles and at particularly rowdy bar trivia nights. Now, to be fair, cocaine wasn't exactly the scandalous demon of the 20th century quite yet. In 1903, it still held a certain scientific allure. Your local neighborhood pharmacist might have compared it to aspirin, only more enthusiastic. But things were turning. Newspapers were growing suspicious. Sensational noses twitched, and so did a few mustaches, at the idea of a drink with such exuberant ingredients being sold with all the casual pomp of penny candy. Enter Asa Candler, the marketing wizard and general manager of the Coca-Cola Company. Asa was many things: a devout Methodist, a wildly enthusiastic advertiser, and a man known for plastering Coca-Cola signage on anything that didn't move, and a few things that did. But Asa was also a pragmatist. He saw where things were going. Cities and states were beginning to sniff at narcotics with stern intentions. The genteel public was growing wary of the word cocaine, and Coca-Cola, once safely nestled among medicine show favorites, now teetered too cozily near controversy. So quietly and without much fanfare or fizz, Candler made a decision that would alter the drink's future forever, even if its name still clung to a slightly misleading memory. The coca leaf was no longer to have its party tricks included. The company would begin to decocanize the formula. The leaves still made their gentle contribution to the flavor, but the stimulating bits were removed, which sounds rather like inviting a rock band to perform and then asking them to leave their instruments at home. To accomplish this, Coca-Cola worked with the Stepan Company, which had figured out how to remove the naughty bits from coca leaves while keeping the innocent aroma intact. These decoconized leaves could still mingle politely in a vat of syrup without causing a moral panic. Yet curiously, no great rebranding occurred. Nobody stood on a corner shouting, "Now cocaine-free," in the same way cereal boxes might boast, "Now with extra fiber." Instead, it was done with the discretion of a Victorian whisper, polite, deliberate, and designed not to startle the horses. By removing cocaine, Coca-Cola began its slow migration from patent medicine to soft drink. The pharmacy counters stopped prescribing it with such theatrical flourish. Instead of healing your nerves, the drink became more about tickling your taste buds. Still with a healthy jolt of caffeine, of course. That part stayed. You didn't want to take all the excitement out of life. Curiously, it was around this time that Coca-Cola began to taste different. Some folks said it lost a little of its zip. Others swore it got smoother. Whatever the case, the company turned its attention from medical promises to marketing dreams. Billboards grew sunnier. Slogans chirped with wholesome glee. Drink Coca-Cola. Relieve fatigue. Enjoy motherhood. Not all at once, ideally. And while nobody officially declared the drink unmedicinal, the public began simply drinking it for fun. Casual, bubbly fun. The kind that didn't require a prescription or a diagnosis. Just a nickel and a thirst. The transformation was nearly complete. So the magical elixir once peddled in apothecaries, alongside leeches and whiskey, was now just rather nice with lunch. But Coca-Cola's evolution didn't stop there. Because while the cocaine was gone, another controversy was beginning to shimmer just below the surface, one involving experiments, lawsuits, and even the US government's very first food fight with a fizzy friend. But let's drift slowly toward that curious courtroom drama. As the bubbles rise gently to the surface, to truly understand how deeply soda pop once soaked itself into the starched linen of respectable medicine, we must now drift down the gilded hallways of early 20th century America, specifically into the office of your local pharmacist. Picture it now. Dark wood counters polished to a sleepy gleam, rows and rows of mysterious glass bottles filled with liquids that shimmered like carnival prizes, and behind the counter, a mustached gentleman in a bow tie, cheerfully compounding a headache remedy that somehow smells faintly of root beer. Ah, yes, the golden age of the soda fountain pharmacist. By the 1910s, doctors and druggists alike had developed a certain fondness for turning bubbly beverages into bottled panaceas. And if the notion of prescribing Coca-Cola for your shattered nerves seems unusual to you now, well, it would have been downright boring to your average patient in 1912. There was scarcely a malady that couldn't be soothed, at least spiritually, by a fizzy concoction dispensed with flair and a splash of showmanship. Pharmacies during this era weren't merely medical facilities, they were social salons, a place to fill your prescriptions for rheumatism and heartbreak alike, best sipped with a long paper straw and the quiet companionship of other regulars seeking a little sparkle in their day. People genuinely believed, and the medical community didn't exactly contradict them, that the gentler side of chemistry could offer comfort and cure, all within the clink of a glass. Coca-Cola was no longer the sole physician favorite by then either. It had inspired a frothing wave of imitators and soda siblings with similarly medicinal ambitions. Vin Mariani, a French tonic made of Bordeaux wine and coca leaves, became the sort of European cousin Coca-Cola would have had over for Christmas. And Pepsi, originally marketed as Brad's drink, promoted itself as a digestive aid for those burdened by over-enthusiastic dinners and Victorian restraint. But let us return to our quiet pharmacist. Imagine him standing behind his polished counter, peering over thick spectacles, preparing what was boldly categorized as a health drink, but now might be mistaken for a syrupy dessert. It came with a hopeful diagnosis and a clink of confidence, a bubbly balm for neurasthenia, or American fatigue, a mysterious catch-all for when the modern world just felt like too much. There were pharmacies where Coca-Cola was sold alongside serious medicines like quinine and laudanum, as if confusion itself had earned a shelf. In an era that fluttered wildly between skepticism and wonder, it made perfect sense to believe that a brownish, sweetly bubbling elixir could lift melancholia, soothe digestion, and revitalize the very soul. Side effects? Probably joy, at least until the caffeinated buzz wore off and reality resumed its grey grip. And let's not neglect the soda jerk. Yes, that was the official title. And no, it wasn't an insult. These confident, white-aproned alchemists were responsible for crafting and serving the drinks with panache, fit for a stage magician. They operated the chrome and ivory levers of the soda fountain with a theatrical flair that might easily distract you from your sciatica. Because if your tonic didn't help, well, at least someone called you sweetheart while scooping in the ice. This intermingling of medicine and merriment, this grand, fizzy charade, thrived until the 1920s, when regulations began to foil the fun. The Pure Food and Drug Act had already begun flexing its bureaucratic muscles, and you can only call something nerve syrup of exquisite rejuvenation for so long before someone in Washington demands a closer reading of the label. Still, even as Coca-Cola shed its coca compounds and lost its seat at the apothecary's throne, it retained something more subtle. It carried with it the aura of medical respectability, the deep soda fountain nostalgia wrapped up in marble counters and upside-down stools. It had been, for some brief and effervescent moment, the prescription not only for ailments, but for modernity itself. And softly now, as our scene fades to sepia, let's follow the quiet hiss of a soda siphon into the next room. A room where advertising men and medical claims begin to tango in a brand new theatre of persuasion. As the sun set on the 1910s and tiptoed into the roaring promise of the 1920s, Coca-Cola had successfully transformed from a dubious tonic with a dash of cocaine into an industrial empire with exceptionally bubbly ambitions. No longer just a pharmacy favorite or a pick-me-up for jittery southern matriarchs. It was now America's fizzy sweetheart. But old habits, as they say, die harder than Prohibition-era moonshine. Though the cocaine had tiptoed out of the bottle by 1929, quietly like a scandalous guest leaving a polite dinner party. It hadn't quite left the prescription pad. You see, doctors, ever eager to soothe the unsoothable, had gotten rather attached to prescribing Coca-Cola for everything from indigestion to fainting spells to what were 1922 medical journal delicately called a deficit in general pep. And general pep, it seemed, was in critically short supply as the Great War faded and flappers filled the jazz halls. Now you might ask, what exactly were these physicians thinking? To understand that, let's transport ourselves into the well-appointed, but slightly cat-hair-covered office of one Dr. Basil Tumblesworth, a fictional yet entirely accurate composite of early-century general practitioners. His office smelled faintly of eucalyptus, disappointment, and the ever-present fizz of his chosen elixir, Coca-Cola, served in a crystal goblet with a lemon wedge for therapeutic freshness. Imagine Dr. Tumblesworth, mustache waxed and pocket watch ticking, listening gravely to the complaints of a Mrs. Eleanora Segsworth. "Doctor," she would sigh, dabbing her brow with a lace handkerchief embroidered with alarming accuracy, "I do believe I suffer from acute listlessness, moral waving, and a general disinclination to sweep." Dr. Tumblesworth, peering over his wire-rimmed spectacles, would nod solemnly, scribble something illegible on the back of last week's advertisement for horse liniment, and declare, 3 glasses of Coca-Cola daily, 1 before chores, 1 after any encounter with in-laws, and 1 with your evening corset unfastening." "Bless you, doctor," she'd murmur, already reaching for her parasol with renewed vigor. And there it was, the gospel of bubbles. The physician's seized tonic. A sip of progress in a bottle that clinked charmingly and came with a mild caffeine zing and a nostalgic echo of forgotten chemistry. But here's where things get particularly fizzy. Because Coca-Cola, despite its increasing popularity as a beverage, was still lingering around the edges of official medicine. Some doctors treated it like a miracle potion. Others scoffed and reached for their leeches instead. In 1916, a curious exchange appeared in a medical periodical where a physician earnestly reported his success in using Coca-Cola to treat hysteria with mild palpitations, while a colleague wrote in a week later suggesting it might also be useful for social withdrawal amongst piano students. And somewhere in the middle, Coca-Cola itself had no idea what to do with all the attention. The company had spent decades trying to distance itself from its snake oil beginnings. And yet, doctors kept prescribing it. With an almost cheeky determination, pharmacists stocked it proudly. Nurses served it with crackers. One New York hospital, for a short while, treated fevers with alternating doses of Coca-Cola and beef broth, which sounds more like a failed soup recipe than a legitimate medical treatment. But here we are. In private homes and public lounges, a glass of Coca-Cola remained 1 part refreshment, 1 part ritual, and 1 part mystery. Mothers gave it to teething babies. Librarians sipped it between alphabetizing the universe. Even clergy were known to take a discreet sip before afternoon sermons, lest their enthusiasm for eternal salvation flag under the weight of lunch. And all the while, advertising played gently in the background, like a soothing lullaby crooned by a syrupy serpent. Newspaper ads proclaimed its health-giving properties with polite vagueness, suggesting that it brightens the brain and refreshes the body, which is exactly the kind of thing you say when you're pretty sure it doesn't hurt anyone. Now, as the 1920s jazzed along and America danced its way toward financial euphoria, or, depending on your sleep schedule, a very expensive nap, the status of Coca-Cola hovered in a twilight zone between medicine and merriment. Doctors still held on to their prescriptions, even as soda fountains multiplied like fizzy fungi in every town center. Because deep down, everyone wanted a little magic in a bottle. And Coca-Cola, with its sparkle, charm, and just enough mystery to keep people guessing, was only too happy to oblige. Just ahead, as the decade continues to hum and fizz, we tiptoe into the odd and oddly profitable friendship between Coca-Cola and the nation's most unlikely collaborator, war. But for now, let's just sit with the gentle hiss of a bottle cap releasing a whisper of bubbles into a sleepy room. By the second decade of the 20th century, Coca-Cola had surged out of drugstores, spilled across soda fountains, and sloshed triumphantly into the cultural bloodstream. All fizzy optimism and questionable health claims. You see, in the early days of its rise, Coca-Cola existed in that shimmering twilight between medicine and candy. It was a miracle elixir, yes, but also an undeniably delightful tickle for your taste buds, like drinking doctor's orders and dessert at the same time. But here's something people often forget. In 1911, all that uninterrupted bubbly success took a rather unexpected pause, thanks to a fellow named Harvey Washington Wiley. Now, Harvey was not a man to be trifled with. He was the first chief chemist at what would later become the Food and Drug Administration. And remarkably, he looked exactly like someone named Harvey Washington Wiley might look. Spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose, moustache swirling like a barbershop piano player's, and a stern affinity for nothing fun. Harvey had a vendetta against what he saw as unwholesome substances slipping into American stomachs under the guise of health. He had already gone after borax in meat, formaldehyde in milk, and a variety of dyes that turned ketchup the color of an aggressive sunset. But then Harvey drew a bead on something with a little more sparkle. Caffeine. You might think of caffeine as the gently persuasive friend that whispers, "You can do this," in your ear each morning. But to Harvey, it was more villain than muse, a stimulant sneaking into children's bodies disguised as refreshing, carbonated joy. And, he warned, this was being peddled by those peddlers of pop, the Coca-Cola Company. So in 1911, the US government actually took Coca-Cola to court. Yes, all of it, the entire beverage. In a case that sounds like a parody, but very much wasn't, the lawsuit was literally United States versus 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola. Quite possibly the only federal case where soda itself was the defendant. The barrels and kegs in question had been seized in Chattanooga under the Pure Food and Drug Act on grounds that Coca-Cola was adulterated and misbranded. Specifically, it didn't contain actual coca anymore, and it still contained caffeine, which Harvey wasn't fond of unless it wore a monocle and asked nicely. The courtroom, one imagines, smelled faintly of bubbles and bureaucracy. The prosecution called experts who solemnly testified that caffeine could stunt the growth of children, ruin digestion, and generally turn a functioning person into a jittery raccoon. The defense, meanwhile, mounted a surprisingly dramatic rebuttal, complete with medical testimonies, studies, and perhaps a knowing nod to the sigh of pleasure emitted after that first sip. And then, in what can only be described as a plot twist befitting a sleepy courtroom drama, the judge ruled in Coca-Cola's favor. Kind of. The court didn't agree that caffeine rendered the beverage injurious, at least not enough to seize a few dozen barrels of it. But, and here's the nudge, Coca-Cola ended up quietly reducing the caffeine levels in their formula anyway. Better not to poke Harvey any further. Now, don't picture this like a humiliating defeat or an American tragedy involving refreshments. Picture it more like a slow dance negotiation between big beverage and big chemistry. Coca-Cola would keep its sparkle, only slightly less zingy. Wiley would go on to retire shortly after, perhaps sensing that battling soda pop was a slippery slope to madness. And yet, that lawsuit cast a long, carbonated shadow. It shaped regulations for food and drink labeling, and it marked the beginning of America's modern relationship with knowing what's actually in that thing you're drinking. A relationship that remains affectionate, suspicious, and full of second helpings. Meanwhile, Coca-Cola emerged from the fracas even more beloved. The trial gave it free publicity after all, and Americans are nothing if not committed to rallying behind their fizzy favorites. Sales went up. The brand grew. And somewhere, perhaps, a young pharmacist blinked up at the stars and thought, someday, I too shall find fortune in flavored water. But before Coca-Cola could truly quench a nation's thirst, or partner with Santa Claus in a legendary global marketing campaign, it still had one more challenge bubbling to the surface, one involving glass bottles, horse-drawn deliveries, and a world reckoning with thirst on an industrial scale. It is a truth universally acknowledged, at least by anyone who's lingered too long inside the annals of medical history, that once a substance enters the physician's black bag, it can take a while, sometimes decades, to exit with dignity. Such was the fate of Coca-Cola, the allegedly curative syrup that was somehow simultaneously a patent medicine, a soft drink, a stimulant, a global business empire, and, for reasons still unclear, a drink your grandma insisted was good for settling the nerves. By the early 1900s, Coca-Cola had already transformed quite dramatically since its original formula, the one that introduced a little dash of cocaine and a whisper of caffeine to help citizens rejoin the land of the living after, say, an afternoon fainting spell or particularly boring sermon. But even after cocaine quietly tiptoed out the back door of the formula around 1903, with no hard feelings apparently, doctors and chemists lingered, still listing Coca-Cola among their medicinal arsenals with all the earnestness of a medieval barber reaching for the leeches. Around this time, a curious transformation began to shape the soul of Coca-Cola, from healing tonic to hydrating companion in hot weather. And sweet listeners, let us not ignore how very thirsty the American South can be during the summer. It gets so sweltering down there, you can practically hear the humidity muttering in your ear. Don't even try to wear socks today. It was in this heat, while fans spun lazily overhead and slowly warmed the room to soup-like temperatures, that Coca-Cola became something of a sensation. Not as a medicine, necessarily, but as a sort of physician's-approved indulgence. You see, there was a rather generous grey area when it came to medical advice in the Edwardian era. If little Timmy's stomach hurt, give him a Coca-Cola and tell him to go lie down. If Aunt Martha refuses to eat because of a delicate constitution, give her a Coca-Cola. If your cousin Harold won't stop reciting Civil War poetry at dinner parties, perhaps don't give him anything, but still, Coca-Cola was cheerfully suggested for nearly every condition west of decapitation. But Coca-Cola's healing halo had one last twist in the tale, a rather poetic legal fracas that unfolded in the spring of 1911, when the United States government, waking momentarily from its slumber of regulatory indifference, decided to sue the syrup. Specifically, the government claimed that Coca-Cola was misbranded. It had no more cocaine, yes, but it still had caffeine, and that would simply not do. They argued that the drink could be harmful, especially in large amounts. Why? School children might develop a taste for it. They might become energetic, distractible, potentially oversweetened. Chaos. What followed was the celebrated court case, United States versus 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola. Not the people, mind you, not the company, not the bottlers, not even the chemists. No, the lawsuit was brought against the barrels and kegs themselves, which were presumably petrified into silence in the courtroom. Still, Coca-Cola's lawyers arrived in spirited defense of the barrels, notebooks in hand, arguments ready to fizz. One particularly impassioned speech declared that caffeine, like sunshine or the laughter of children, was only dangerous in unreasonable quantities, which, if you think about it, is true of just about everything, including bagpipes and to-do lists. Eventually, the case was dismissed. The government appealed. The appeal was overruled. By the time it all wound down, the court had decided not to seize the barrels, and Coca-Cola went back to sweetening afternoons and mildly jittering household cats who'd stuck their noses into unattended glasses. But from that strange and syrupy legal epic, a quiet shift began. No longer was Coca-Cola hawked in apothecaries or behind pharmacy counters beside bitter tonics and denture adhesives. It found a new identity entirely, reclining comfortably in refrigerated vending machines, in cheerful contour bottles, and in the uniquely American belief that somehow sugary bubbles might just fix your day. And perhaps, in a tender way, that old medicinal promise continued, not through pharmacology, but through memory. Grandparents still handed you a Coke when your Sunday school crush didn't notice your new hairbow. Uncles offered it sheepishly after bumping your bicycle with the car. Parents, aware of its sticky power, poured it over ice with the kind of reverence usually reserved for aged whiskey. So no, perhaps Coca-Cola didn't cure everything, but it made its way from tonic to tradition, one fizz at a time. And somewhere, beneath the warm glow of a dusty pharmacy sign, another bottle cap popped gently open, inviting one last sip as the century swayed towards sleep. And so we return, our minds reclined like velvet slippers at the end of a long historical promenade, to the cool golden fizz at the bottom of the bottle, the final sip of cola and curiosity alike. The story of Coca-Cola as a remedy, a luxury, a legend, has bubbled along from pharmacy counters to every corner store, leaving sugar, scandal, and a suspicious amount of pep in its wake. By the time we reached the 1920s, Coca-Cola had already traded its lab coat for a bow tie. No longer just the pharmacist's fizzing friend, it had waltzed confidently into popular culture, riding on waves of clever marketing, temperance politics, and a caffeinated sense of destiny. Its medicinal claims, once loftily pronounced with a straight face, had withered quietly behind a veil of advertising wizardry. After all, it's easier to sell happiness than headache relief. But Coca-Cola didn't simply give up its medical ambitions because science caught up, or because someone in a white coat shook their head ruefully. No, it evolved. Like a sleepy lizard in the sun that slowly learns it can sell sunglasses instead of scales. You see, long after the cocaine had evaporated from its chemistry and the pharmacy counter had been replaced by soda fountains and baseball stadiums, Coca-Cola quietly rebranded itself, not as a medicine you needed, but as a feeling you wanted. Cold refreshment, smiles under straw hats, romance in glass bottles. No prescription necessary. One could say the product finally found its true specialty: emotional medicine. The kind of sweet placebo for the soul that pairs well with picnics, first kisses, and holiday jingles played entirely too soon. But make no mistake, even as the bottle glowed amber in the summer sun or rested in sock-hop fridges beside gelatin salads and ambitious casseroles, the company behind it always kept its lab coat starched and ready. In fact, Coca-Cola continued to dabble in borderline medical territory, if not physically, at least philosophically. Ads whispered that Coke was the pause that refreshes, as if refreshment were something clinical. Side effects may include looking cooler, smiling more, and enduring your in-laws with a surprising amount of patience. Meanwhile, science marched on, increasingly skeptical of sugary miracles. In the 1950s, researchers began pointing accusing fingers at refined sugar and caffeine, declaring them no longer delightful, but diabolical. The soda, once a health tonic, had now become a suspect in the court of nutritional law. And there it's remained, dangling between guilty pleasure and nostalgic necessity. Yet, through lawsuits and low-carb revolutions, Coca-Cola kept fizzing along. A product born in the crucible of 19th century patent medicine had, by sleight of hand and soft labeling, transformed into a global habit. Presidents drank it. Astronauts tried to sip it in space. At one point, the brand was better known globally than the word hello, which is frankly alarming, unless you find solace in the universal language of carbonation. Now, of course, Coke no longer claims to heal your nerves or calm your bowels. Though, interestingly, plenty of grandmothers still swear it'll settle your stomach faster than any over-the-counter remedy. And when you're 8 years old and lying on a couch with a bucket and a ginger-colored liquid in hand, you might briefly believe them. Today, the true legacy of Coca-Cola's medical chapter sits quietly in museums, in dusty advertisements, declaring its virtues as a nerve tonic and cure for headaches. It's hard not to crack a sleepy smile at the idea that, once upon a time, the same bubbly beverage that now accompanies popcorn and paper straws was recommended by men in waistcoats for female hysteria, which reminds us gently that history is not a line, but a loop. What starts as medicine may end as snack, and what begins in a pharmacy may eventually sponsor the Olympics. And so, with our slippers on and our minds fizzy with strange knowledge, we drift quietly into the closing credits of this peculiar tale. Coca-Cola, once a hopeful syrup in a chemist's kettle, has become the accidental alchemist of our age, turning folk remedy into pop culture treasure. Not quite the medicine we thought we needed, but still, somehow, exactly what the moment ordered. Sleep sweetly now, history traveler. The bottle is empty. The past has softened. And there's nothing left to do but let your thoughts dissolve like sugar in warm tea.